Disaster risk management. Post-disaster reconstruction. Introduction. When a disaster strikes, immediate response is needed to rescue lives. Once the emergency period is past, a more systematic effort to build back the lives of the affected community unfolds. Relief, followed by reconstruction, form the two main stages of post-disaster response. The session discusses what is relief and what is reconstruction? How do the impacts of disasters vary? How are the impacts of disasters valued? What is the Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, PDNA, framework? Who does them, and how does a country use them? What is the potential of damage and reconstruction needs assessment in disaster prevention policy formulation? And what are the financial resources for reconstruction? What is relief and what is reconstruction? A disaster's during phase tends to be short in sudden disasters, such as earthquakes, hurricanes or typhoons, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, etc., but may last several months, as in the case of climatic phenomena, or years, as in the case of severe droughts. The during phase consists of emergency response and rehabilitation. The visibility of a disaster is highest in the during phase, and most activity occurs at this time. It is during the emergency response and immediate rehabilitation stages that most intervention occurs. During the short-term emergency response phase, the priority is to save lives. The preservation of lifelines and health facilities and the relevant redundancy of these services are essential in the response phase. In general, experience shows that the damage assessment should not begin until the humanitarian assistance stage is completed or well underway, so as not to interfere with search and rescue activities, and to ensure the availability of sufficient quantitative information on direct, indirect, and microeconomic damage and losses. Moreover, given that the assessment team will require the assistance of numerous national and regional counterparts from the affected areas, assessment work must be scheduled to begin when such personnel are no longer involved in humanitarian assistance efforts. In the rehabilitation stage that follows, the focus is to return activities in the affected area to normal. It is at this time that it is appropriate to initiate an evaluation of direct and indirect damages. Finally, the after phase, although it begins during the emergency, properly starts when the reconstruction process begins. This is more of a medium to long-term phase. The Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, PDNA, is conducted to estimate the damages and resources needed for reconstruction. Unfortunately, it often requires resources well beyond those available during the emergency or rehabilitation stages, or otherwise within reach of the affected country. As a result, reconstruction is often undertaken without vulnerability reduction. Thus, at this point, the priority is to implement mitigation so that pre-disaster vulnerability is not rebuilt. Impacts of disasters. After a disaster event, the physical environment is degraded, as are networks of social interaction. People begin to feel insecure and lose confidence in their way of life. Access to education, health and food is made more difficult, and the loss of homes and belongings reduces normal living standards. Effects differ depending on the sex of the affected population. Men generally sustain higher capital stock losses, while women usually end up facing increased reproductive workloads. In order to measure the effects of a disaster, value the losses, and target reconstruction efforts strategically, we need to understand how the impacts of disasters can vary. Disasters cause loss of lives, damage to property, and disruption of the economy. The impact due to the loss of lives and injuries are difficult to quantify. Damage assessment therefore mostly focuses on socio-economic and environmental damages that occur as a consequence of natural catastrophes. These losses of assets, as well as the impact on the flow of goods and services, vary according to nature of hazard, the time, strength and duration of the disastrous event, Effects can be direct and indirect, and affect different sectors of the economy in distinct ways. Affect countries differently depending upon their level of economic development. Affect the poor disproportionately. Different hazards, different disaster impacts. The impact of different hazards on a community is different. As we have seen earlier in Module 1, droughts are the most deadly, in comparison to earthquakes, floods and storms. The figure shows that deaths due to droughts in Africa have been the highest, as compared to deaths due to earthquakes in other parts of the world. Earthquakes and storms cause the most damage to property. Different countries, different disaster impacts. Countries suffer disproportionately due to disasters. As we've seen earlier in Module 2, while cumulative deaths due to disasters have reduced in Asia and the Americas, they have increased in Africa. Most of the 3.3 million deaths over the last 40 years were in poor countries. In poorer countries, high poverty and unemployment rates, distributional inequalities, socio-economic exclusion of the poor from basic services, strong population growth, and lack of strong national and local institutions for dealing with natural disasters contribute to vulnerability. On the other hand, damages to property as a proportion of GDP are disproportionately high in middle-income countries. In comparison, poor countries have few assets and consequently incur little damage, while rich countries have resources to effectively prevent damage. Damages to property have increased in middle-income countries, whereas they have decreased in Africa. A single event can adversely affect the economy of a small country. Many of the 25 countries with damages more than 1% of GDP are small island economies. Additionally, many countries are subject to multiple hazards due to the natural clustering of hazards. Earthquakes and volcanoes tend to cluster along fault boundaries in mountainous terrain. Floods, cyclones and landslides affect the eastern coastal regions of the major continents, as well as some interior regions of North and South Africa. Direct and indirect disaster impacts. A disaster can affect a community indirectly, apart from direct loss of lives and damage to property, where communities are dependent on each other for economic functions. While direct damages encompass impacts on assets, such as physical infrastructure, capital and stocks, indirect effects, on the other hand, are alterations of flows in goods and services, as well as other economic flows, such as costs or increased expenses, reduced income, and business profits or losses. Also indirect are losses in production that was not yet completed, or agricultural yield harvested at the time of disaster. In other words, income foregone due to the disaster. Indirect effects are often adverse. There are many methods for measuring the indirect effects of a disaster. Studies differ on whether and how factors such as simultaneous changes in commodity prices, terms of trade, exchange rates, etc., that affect output from an affected place, can be taken into account when measuring the effect of a disaster. Indirect effects are less evident when the assessment is carried out, and are difficult to express in monetary terms. Indirect effects may not always be adverse. For example, farmers in an affected area who have not lost their crops get higher prices if overall harvest is lower. Poverty and disaster impacts. The poor in rural and urban areas suffer disproportionately. In rural areas, natural hazards can cause disruption in agricultural activities. Extended periods of drought that are induced by climate change often force the poor to abandon their traditional agricultural-based occupations and migrate to urban centres for alternate employment. In urban areas, the numbers of the poor are increasing. The urban poor live near work on hazardous but cheaper land that is usually ill-serviced. The poor have no affordable alternative but to locate in high-risk areas, have few resources to reduce their risks, and have little or no access to post-event resources for recovery. Why do we need to assess post-disaster damages? Recovery requires that commerce resume, and this involves restoring the affected area's links with the rest of the economy. It is in the self-interest of people and private firms up and down the supply chain to repair these links, banking, trucking, but physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, railways, is often the government's responsibility. Assessing damage to public infrastructure is urgent, and governments must quickly decide what, where, and whether to rebuild. This decision will in turn affect individual decisions to rebuild. Damage assessments after a disaster differ in scope, purpose, and technique. Knowing disaster's effects on fiscal sustainability is important for making informed decisions. While the government can borrow, it must ultimately pay it all back from taxes or spending cuts elsewhere. Individuals and businesses tend to expedite recovery with appropriate and timely help from family, suppliers, customers, NGOs, and the government. But individuals and businesses also rely on public infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and railways. The government must therefore quickly assess the damage to public infrastructure, the cost of repairs and rebuilding, and the fiscal implications. The main purpose of disaster valuation is to determine the reconstruction needs. It enables identification of the most affected geographical areas and sectors, and the corresponding reconstruction priorities. It helps balance spending on relief and reconstruction, and can guide government relief, such as how much to spend on alleviating the victims' suffering, knowing that other spending must be cut or taxes raised. For example, if relief and recovery spending displace maintenance of infrastructure, as is common, deaths and damage from future disasters would increase. In addition, it estimates the effects on economic flows and helps to determine the country's capacity to undertake reconstruction and the needed international financial and technical cooperation. It also serves as a tool in policy formulation and resource allocation after a disaster. It allows us to project the future performance of the affected economy in the short and medium term, and on that basis, implement the necessary corrective economic policy measures. It also provides the necessary information for the formulation of mitigation strategies. Disaster valuation. How are the impacts of disasters valued? The impacts of disasters are assessed by measuring two factors. A. Welfare impacts, that are aspects of well-being, health, nutrition, education and mental state of mind, and B. Output impacts, the local and economy-wide effects on output measured by the GDP. While studies on the short to medium-term effects of a disaster on poverty abound, data to examine the longer-term effects on human welfare are scant. The valuation of disasters must be conducted differently when serving different purposes. When done for the sake of historical record formation, the information gathered must be comparable over time and across different types of events, or geographical coverage, across country studies, impact on communities, etc. In this case, to ensure consistency, both direct and indirect effects are valued at present value. For reconstruction purposes, the valuation is done using replacement value in order to permit budgeting and covers only direct damages. Reconstruction pricing here includes the inevitable technological improvement and specific considerations of mitigation. In fact, reconstruction should never mean the restoration of pre-disaster conditions, since the disaster exposed vulnerabilities that can now be reduced. Welfare impacts. Disaster effects on welfare include decline in school enrollment. Enrollment rates for children aged 7 to 15 fell by about 20% in parts of Côte d'Ivoire, with extreme rainfall changes between 1986 and 1987. Temporary withdrawal from school sometimes becomes permanent. Children withdrawn from schools during droughts in central Mexico between 1998 and 2000 were about 30% less likely to resume their studies. Malnutrition. Malnourished children may become permanently stunted. In the Kagera region of Tanzania, Children younger than 5 years, exposed to a drought in 1991 to 94, were roughly 1% shorter than the population's median height 10 years later. Diminished cognitive abilities. Malnutrition also diminishes cognitive skills by inhibiting learning and productivity. In rural Zimbabwe and rural Tanzania, malnutrition reduced school enrollment and also reduced children's height and educational achievements as adolescents regressed. Reduced earnings. Children malnourished during the 1982 to 84 droughts in Zimbabwe had a 7% loss in lifetime earnings. Mental health. For 9,000 adult survivors of the 2004 tsunami in Aceh, post-traumatic stress reaction (PTSR) scores for each respondent in affected areas were high for as much as 6 to 14 months after the tsunami. But even without treatment, these scores declined with time. Output impacts. Well-being and output are not the same. The effect of disasters on national output is not always clear. Different studies use different data and estimation techniques. National output always falls after a severe disaster, but sometimes rises after a mild one, even though the affected people are obviously worse off. For example, after an earthquake, the output is reduced. However, subsequent reconstruction increases economic activity. And since economic growth measures the rate of change of output, growth could exceed pre-disaster rates as output catches up to its pre-disaster level. Although our understanding of economic growth is incomplete, experts agree that even short-lived impacts of disasters on health and education can have long-term effects on income and well-being. Disasters reduce the well-being of those affected, but may or may not have a negative impact on output growth in the medium term, 5 years, which depends in part on the severity and type of hazard and the level of economic development. Storms and droughts seem to have systematic negative impacts on medium-term growth. However, this is not the case with floods and earthquakes. Severe disasters have adverse effects regardless of their type. PDNA, a development strategy. Post-disaster needs assessment, PDNA, is a synthesis of the DALA methodology, developed by the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, UNECLAC, in 1972. The PDNA contains damage, loss and macroeconomic impacts on the affected economy, impacts on livelihoods, incomes and human development, short, medium and long-term recovery and reconstruction needs, and measures for mainstreaming disaster risk reduction in post-disaster recovery and reconstruction plans. The PDNA measures in monetary terms the impact of disasters on the society, economy and environment of the affected country or region. The PDNA valuation uses the standard national accounts categories, supplemented with disaster impact estimates on non-standard categories such as environment and gender. The PDNA is increasingly recognized as an internationally accepted standard. A unique aspect of the PDNA is that it is led and owned by the government of the affected country and assisted by a multidisciplinary, multi-agency team comprising the World Bank, GFDRR, UN agencies, European Commission and other relevant stakeholders. Such a process leads to greater cooperation and reduced duplication of efforts, both during the assessment of damages, losses and needs, and during the recovery and reconstruction phase. PDNA methodology. The PDNA methodology has two main components: social assessments, estimate the affected population, and sectoral assessments, macroeconomic assessments and projects. Social assessments estimate the affected population in terms of primary, secondary and tertiary categories. The primary affected population is affected by the direct effects of the disaster and consists of the dead, the injured and the disabled, primary trauma victims, as well as those who suffer material losses as a direct and immediate consequence of the disaster. The secondary and tertiary affected populations suffer a disaster's indirect effects. The sectoral assessments measure, in monetary terms, all direct damages and indirect losses sustained by the affected population in social sectors, productive sectors, infrastructure and the environment. On the basis of all these, we determine the variation in terms of the national accounts, i.e., the value-added changes expected for every sector in the short term, and for a medium-term period to be agreed, 3 to 5 years or more. If possible, supported by input-output tables or sector weighing factors, we determine the projection of damages and effects from one sector to the others. A damage scenario is ultimately built, taking into account the measured losses at replacement value. The scenario highlights variations in the main economic gaps, such as the external sector, fiscal deficit, internal equilibrium, prices, exchange rate, etc. Macroeconomic projections. A valid estimate of the macroeconomic effects of a disaster requires a reliable forecast of how each of the variables would have performed had the disaster not occurred. The most important macroeconomic effects of a disaster are those that have a bearing on growth in gross domestic product and in sectoral production. They are the current account balance, due to changes in the trade balance, tourism and services, as well as outflows to pay for imports and foreign services, etc., indebtedness and monetary reserves, and public finances and gross investment. Such a projection serves as the baseline for ascertaining the degree to which the disaster disrupted results that would have been achieved otherwise, and the extent to which the deterioration in the main variables has affected the country's ability to meet rehabilitation and reconstruction requirements, and to define international cooperation requirements, especially of a financial nature. It is important to keep in mind that the estimate of macroeconomic effects only shows what would happen should the authorities of the affected country or region not modify current public policies and programs. Performance projection thus provides these officials with a tool for reorienting policies and plans in light of post-disaster reconstruction needs that can include risk mitigation. The magnitude of the disaster is important for defining the time frame for which macroeconomic effects are to be estimated. Experience shows that a reasonable time is normally the remainder of the year in which the disaster occurs, short term, plus another 1, 2, or, under exceptional circumstances, 5 years, medium term. Haiti 2010 PDNA. As an example, let us take a closer look at the Haiti 2010 PDNA. On January the 12th, 2010, a powerful earthquake of magnitude 7.3 on the Richter scale shook Haiti. The earthquake affected all sectors of society, creating an unprecedented situation. Over 1.5 million people were directly affected. Many lost lives and were injured. Many required psychological support, and many became homeless and migrated to the provinces. Hundreds of thousands of homes were completely destroyed or damaged. Educational establishments, hospitals and health centres collapsed. The President's Palace, Parliament, the law courts and most public administration buildings were destroyed. The PDNA was undertaken to reconstruct the damaged areas and contribute to a long-term national strategic development plan. Over 200 experts worked in 8 thematic teams: governance, production, social sectors, infrastructure, regional development, the environments, and disaster risk management, as well as macroeconomic analysis. The PDNA estimated the total value of damage and losses to be 120% of the country's GDP in 2009. 7 priority areas were identified. 1. Prepare for the 2010 rainy cyclone season, ensuring participation by women and young people. 2. Provide for the well-being, nutrition and care of Haiti's children. 3. Immediately and systematically incorporate environmental aspects in all decisions. 4. Build risk and disaster management measures into the reconstruction process. 5. Put in place an active employment policy based on micro-businesses. 6. Reconstruct the state and the economy so they are able to serve all the people of Haiti. And 7. Relieve congestion in the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area by putting in place incentives for settling the population around growth hubs. Common pitfalls of damage assessment. Making informed decisions requires reliable estimates of the relevant measurement concepts of damage and loss. Given the complexity of assessing the value of direct and indirect damages due to disasters, there are two common pitfalls in post-disaster damage assessment: overestimating, by measuring damages twice over, and underestimating, by measuring damages half under, since it is difficult to value the loss of life or damage to the environment. Many estimators, reporters and aid agencies add damages and losses together that may result in double counting. For example, when a rental apartment building collapses, the lost asset value from physical damage equals the present value of the lost income flow from the affected assets. While damage to privately owned assets can be determined, valuing the damage to public infrastructure is more complicated, since these assets do not have market-based valuations. Valuing the flow of lost economic benefits is harder, and the economic rate of return on the public asset may be far greater than the rate of return on private capital. Even so, a damaged asset generates a smaller income flow, and the economic value of the physical damage is the present value of this reduced flow, which may not equate to the capital loss or to the cost of repair and reconstruction. This implies that adding measures of the lost social benefits from damage to a public hospital and cost of construction would double the output losses. Damage estimates can also underestimate the impacts. The value of lives lost is not tangible. Destructions of the commons, such as environmental buffers, forests, are rarely included because they are difficult to value and have no well-defined claimants. The effect on natural capital is further complicated because it is not possible to distinguish disasters that have positive side effects, such as floods that increase the fertility or forest fires that sustain forests, from those that do not. Clearly, what is valuable is not always amenable to measurement. How can PDNA inform prevention policies? Damage assessment provides useful information about vulnerabilities, exposure to, and severity of disasters that can and should be used for risk management purposes. Firstly, the assessment provides information about the affected regions, the vulnerability of groups and sectors, and the magnitude of the disaster's effects. When designing mitigation and prevention measures for reconstruction, we need to know where to implement them, the communities with which to work, which sectors and social groups deserve the most attention, and what resources they require. The damage and needs assessment is the starting point to make these decisions. Secondly, according to the valuation methodology, for reconstruction purposes, the direct damages are assessed using replacement prices. The replacement prices should include mitigation investment and incentives such as reinforcement, redesign, relocation, or other vulnerability reduction measures. The damages valued in these terms are used to determine the funding needs for reconstruction. Building back better is a core principle for resilient recovery, as well as the leverage for the longer mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction into sustainable development. Reconstruction should not reproduce the pre-existing risk conditions, i.e., maintain vulnerability at pre-disaster levels. Turkey. Resilient recovery. Let us take the case of Turkey. The Marmara earthquakes struck Izmit with a 7.4 magnitude on August 17, 1999, and struck Düzce, about 100 kilometers east, with a 7.2 magnitude on November 12th of the same year. The 1999 Marmara earthquakes followed a well-recorded westward movement of earthquakes along the 1,500-kilometer North Anatolian fault line. After caring for the dead and the injured, the government considered how to prevent similar disasters by increasing insurance coverage, promoting safer building practices, and better emergency response preparedness. The government reduced its liability by promoting disaster insurance. It established a quasi-governmental Turkish Catastrophe Insurance Pool, TCIP. It made earthquake insurance mandatory for all residential buildings within a municipality and to qualify for cheap loans under existing schemes, and voluntary for industrial and commercial buildings. The insurance premiums reflect risks and prevention measures. However, only 22.3% of registered urban dwellings countrywide were insured as of June 2009, since the insurance applies to only the legally built buildings with proper permits. The insurance is not enforceable on illegal constructions that are quite prevalent. Lack of information on hazards, such as the precise location of fault lines and how to build safer structures, contributes to unsafe building practices. The Istanbul Risk Mitigation and Emergency Preparedness Project has helped the provincial administration develop rules of thumb to help choose between retrofitting and rebuilding, and improved Turkey's building code and its enforcement. The unprecedented scale of this retrofitting is improving engineering practices. Greater Istanbul and the Istanbul Governorate have sought to reduce the city's vulnerability by increasing emergency preparedness. That includes skills and technical capacities of response units, as well as public awareness and training. Turkey is building new disaster management centres with modern emergency management information and communication equipment. Financing reconstruction. GFDRR, together with United Nations, European Union, and other multilateral and bilateral institutions, provides technical assistance and fast-track financing for recovery and reconstruction planning. The GFDRR supports sustainable recovery in low-income countries through its Standby Recovery Financing Facility, SRFF, that encourages governments to invest in disaster risk reduction and link recovery financing with ex-ante disaster reduction, climate change adaptation, and catastrophic risk financing markets. The SRFF offers two financing windows: the Technical Assistance Fund to support damage, loss and needs assessments and develop national capacity for recovery planning and implementation, the Callable Fund for accelerated recovery to provide speedy access to financial resources for disaster recovery and reconstruction. The GFDRR labs, set up in cooperation with the United Nations and other multilateral agencies to apply innovation in the practice of DRM across regions, offers a PDNA service, amongst others, that provides real-time mapping support and damage validation through remote sensing and Earth observation. For example, the Global Earth Observation Catastrophe Assessment Network, GEOCAN, a community of 600 risk professionals from 23 countries, completed a rapid building-by-building, crowdsourced damage assessment of the Haiti earthquake. However, most often, countries that are in a state of disaster emergency find it challenging to coordinate the plethora of resources offered by various relief organizations. Past experiences in disaster response has highlighted a gap in global capacity to efficiently track post-crises reconstruction finance from PDNA to long-term rehabilitation and ensure transparency and accountability. DREAMIS, an innovative financial management tool for governments and agencies involved in disaster recovery and risk reduction, has been developed recently to address this gap. Summary. In this session, we have developed an understanding of the primary concerns in post-disaster reconstruction, relief and reconstruction activities, the impacts of disasters and how they vary, how impacts of disasters are valued, the essentials of the PDNA framework, how relief and reconstruction efforts can contribute to disaster prevention, and how we can access finance for disaster reconstruction. This session also offers a path to a more extensive study of reconstruction through the links to additional resources and case studies. Text and figures are adapted from World Bank, United Nations 2010.